Welcome to our second discussion on federalism. Before we begin, I must note I neglected to put in Gibbons versus Ogden when talking about implied powers in the first one. So please add this to your notes from the first one. Gibbons versus Ogden in 1825 was seeking to clarify the constitutional meaning of the word commerce. The court ruled that regulation of commerce implied regulation of navigation and that therefore the national government had authority to regulate it, not New York State. Livingston and Fulton had won a monopoly of New York State river navigation, and the former New Jersey governor, Ogden, obtains a license from Livingston and Fulton and then goes into business with Gibbons. It falls apart and monopoly is challenged. Okay, so let's get on to part two. The topics that will be covered today are fiscal federalism, devolution, block grants, Dillon's rule, home rule charter, special district governments, police power, initiative, referendum, recall, grants and aid, categorical grants, conditions of aid, vertical federalism, and horizontal federalism. So let's talk about devolution. Devolution is the effort to devolve onto the states the national government's functions in areas such as welfare, healthcare, and job training. If we're going to talk about block grants, categorical grants, revenue sharing, and conditions of aid, we first must talk about fiscal federalism. Fiscal federalism involves the offer of money from the national government to the states in the form of grants to promote national ends such as public welfare, environmental standards, and educational improvements. Until 1911, federal grants were used only to support agricultural research and education. With the passage of the 16th Amendment in 1916, which legalized the federal income tax, the national government gained a significant source of revenue that is used to shape national policy in a variety of new policy areas. So let's talk about categorical grants. Historically, the most common type of grant and aid has been the categorical formula grant, a grant of money from the federal government to state and local governments for a narrow purpose, as defined by the federal government. The legislation that creates such a grant includes a formula determining how much money is available to each grant recipient. The formula is typically based on factors related to the purpose of the grant, such as the number of people in the state in need of the program's benefits. The Census Bureau collects much of the data used in grant formulas through the decennial, which occurring every 10 years, census, which is mandated by the U.S. Constitution. More than $400 billion grant dollars will be distributed based on the data collected in the 2010 census. Categorical grants come with strings, that is, rules and regulations with which the recipient government must comply. One typical condition is a matching funds requirement, which obligates the government receiving the grant to spend some of its own money to match a specified percentage of the grant money provided. Matching funds requirements allow the national government to influence the budget decisions of state and local governments by forcing them to spend some of their own money on national priority, which may or may not also be a state priority, in order to receive national funding. Categorical grants became a major policy tool of the national government during the New Deal era and expanded rapidly during the 1960s Great Society. But state and local officials began to criticize this method of national support because of the costly grant application and implementation procedures. They also complained that it was difficult to adapt the grants to the local needs. Unlike the formula grant, a project grant, does not include a formula specifying how much money a recipient will receive. Instead, state and local governments interested in receiving such a grant must compete for it by writing proposals detailing what programs they wish to implement and what level of funding they need. A categorical project grant has strings attached to it and typically offers much less funding than a categorical formula grant. Let's talk about block grants. Beginning in the mid-1960s, block grants, which combined several categorical grants in broad policy areas into one general grant, became increasingly popular. States prefer block grants because they allow state officials to adapt the grants to their particular needs. Congress, however, is reluctant to use block grants because they loosen Congress's control over how the money is spent. When first introduced by the Nixon administration in the 1970s, the block grant also had fewer strings attached to it than the categorical grants. Today, however, the number and the specificity of conditions included in block grants are increasing. Revenue sharing was developed during the Nixon administration as a way to provide monies to the state with no strings attached. Using statistical formulas to account for differences among states, the national government provided billions of dollars to the states until the program was abolished in 1986. Conditions of aid just means that there are conditions that go along with the grants. You must have a certain number of minority people involved. You must include a certain number of women-owned businesses, things like that. Let's look at a couple charts having to do with grants. If you look at the federal grants ranged from 25 to 50% of states' 2010 revenues provided by the Pew Analysis of U.S. Census Bureau, you can see that New York is right in the middle at 36 to 40% of the state's revenues came from the federal government, as opposed to some states that are lower and some states that are higher, obviously. Next, you have the post-1960s explosion of federal grants to state and local governments. This is from 1960 to 2011. Obviously, it's 2 years old, but it's pretty current. So if you look at this, all of these are going up. But then you also have to take into consideration that our GDP is increasing as well. But obviously, the costs of everything are increasing, so the number of grants are increasing, but not necessarily the number of dollars if you look at it statistically. All right, so let's take a time out and go to a multiple choice question. Which of the following forms of financial aid from the national government gives the states the broadest discretion in the spending of money? A, categorical grants and aid, B, foreign aid, C, unfunded mandates, D, block grants, or E, military funding. Why don't you pause the video and come back with your answer. Okay, welcome back. I hope that you chose D, block grants, because block grants have the fewest strings attached, and they are going to give the states the broadest discretion in spending of money. So how much discretion should we have? Well, let's dissect this. When a state government establishes a local government, the state government specifies the local government structures, institutions, and responsibilities in a constitutional document called a charter. Traditionally, state governments wrote and approved local government charters that specified not only the structures but also the functions of local government. Following Dillon's rule, a principle articulated by Iowa Supreme Court Judge John Forrest Dillon in 1868 and employed in hundreds of U.S. court decisions, local governments are creatures of the state that created them, and as such, they have the powers expressly mentioned in their state-written and approved charters, and those necessarily implied by the formally expressed powers. In recent decades, however, most states have allowed for home rule by giving their citizens the opportunity to write, adopt, and amend local government charters at the city and county levels. A citizens' commission typically drafts these so-called home rule charters, which voters then accept or reject. These charters typically give the local government greater discretion in its activities than do state-developed charters. In comparison with local governments based on Dillon's rule, localities with home rule have discretion to determine the extent of their powers and responsibilities, as long as they comply with limits imposed by their state and by the U.S. Constitution. In 1973, Congress enacted the District of Columbia Home Rule Act. This act devolved certain congressional powers for the governance of Washington, D.C., the federal district that is the nation's capital city, to local government. The federal law includes the District Home Rule Charter, which provides for the citizens living in D.C. to elect a mayor and 13 members to a city council. Under the District Home Rule Charter, Congress maintains its constitutionally granted authority over the city, with authority to veto laws enacted by the city government and over the city's budget. In 1980, D.C. citizens passed an initiative calling for a constitutional convention. In 1982, the citizens ratified a constitution for a new state, New Columbia. The battle over statehood for Washington, D.C. continues today. All right, so let's talk about state sovereignty. State sovereignty include things like initiative, referendum, recall, and proposition. A referendum is an election in which voters in a state can vote for or against a measure proposed by the state legislature. Frequently, referenda concern matters such as state bond issues, state constitutional amendments, and controversial pieces of legislation. An initiative, sometimes called an initiative petition, is a citizen-sponsored proposal that can result in a new or amended legislation or a state constitutional amendment. Initiatives differ from referenda in that they are typically propelled to public vote through the efforts of citizens and interest groups. The initiative process usually requires that 10% of the number of the voters in the previous election in that state sign a petition agreeing that the proposition or proposed measure should be placed on the ballot. An example of an initiative is California's Proposition 8, also called the California Marriage Protection Act, which passed with a majority of votes in the November 2008 state elections. Prop 8, other Proposition 8, amended California's state constitution to read only a marriage between a man and a woman is valid or recognized in California. As a state constitutional amendment, Prop 8 had the effect of overturning the California Supreme Court decision stating that same-sex couples have the right to marry. That decision had nullified a previous initiative, Proposition 22, in which a majority of voters had statutorily banned same-sex marriage. Another issue with state sovereignty is police power. One generally recognized state power is the police power, which refers to those laws and regulations not otherwise unconstitutional that promote health, safety, and morals. Thus, the states can enact and enforce criminal codes, require children to attend school and citizens to be vaccinated, and restrict, subject to many limitations, the availability of pornographic materials or the activities of prostitutes and drug dealers. As a practical matter, the most important activities of state and local governments involve public education, law enforcement, and criminal justice, health and hospitals, roads and highways, public welfare, and control over the use of public land and water supplies. On these and many other matters, state constitutions tend to be far more detailed than the federal constitution and to embody a more expansive view of both governmental responsibilities and individual rights than it does. So let's look at a map that shows us how the states break down. The yellow ones, initiative for legislation and popular referendum. The blue ones, popular referendum only. The orange ones, initiative for constitutional amendments only. The gray ones, which you'll notice New York State is neither method is used for legislation. And then you have the dots on there with states with recall. All right, so let's talk about vertical versus horizontal federalism. When you're talking about vertical federalism, you're talking about any time the federal government steps in to help the states. Katrina and Superstorm Sandy are examples. Another recent unfortunate example was the Boston Marathon bombings. When President Obama, in a state of the... I apologize for misspeaking. In Obama's address to the people after the Boston bombing, he basically said, what do you need? So anytime the federal government and the president says, what do you need, that is an example of vertical federalism. Horizontal federalism examples include interstate compacts like education, paroled inmates, driver's licenses, extradition, or privileges and immunities. Citizens from other states who visit or move into the state are given the same privileges and immunities of the current citizens of that state. That is a huge argument when it comes to legalization of marijuana and gay marriage. The full faith and credit clause is another example. Each state must recognize as legally binding public acts, records, and judicial proceedings. For an example, the Defense of Marriage Act of 1996 is problematic, amongst other things. Make sure that you are able to do the multiple choice questions, and I do believe that it has been fixed so that your answer will not appear if you receive a wrong answer. Please let me know if that is not the case. Thank you.